there is a value in the short-term trips. Not everyone will be interested in going to an unreached place. So you have to start somewhere. And, I've found that sometimes starting with a trip to Africa or a trip to Cuba or someplace like that at least opens the mind up so that when we come back, we can then start getting more involved to who they're going to be standing with in Revelation.
The Mission Matters podcast is a partnership between 1615 and Missio Nexus, who have a shared passion to mobilize the people of God to be a part of His mission.
Well, hello and welcome once again to the Mission Matters podcast. I'm Matthew Ellison, and right across the way there is my good friend and co-host Ted Esler. Ted, greetings, my friend.
Hey, good to see you.
Well, I'm really excited about today's topic and guest. We have Larrie Fraley, who is the missions pastor at CCV, let me say that again, in Peoria, Arizona. Larry's a good friend. We've been swinging swords together now for a few years. Larry, what a pleasure to have you on the podcast today.
Well, it's certainly a pleasure being here.
Well, Larry, why don't you let our audience know a little bit about yourself and what you're up to these days?
Well, I am the missions pastor, the global and local missions pastor at Christ Church of the Valley. I've actually been at CCV since we started the church back in 1982. So going on, 43 years now. I've been around CCV and was able to be one of the very first four officers to kind of start the organization with Don Wilson. And so I've not been on staff that length of time. I was involved with CCV as a elder and a lay leader up until 1998 when I left Intel Corporation after 20 some years and came on board as an executive pastor. And then went back to school. Didn't have really any biblical training, and so went back to school. And it seems to be a continual learning experience for me. I'm going on 74 now, I'm going on 75 and in the middle of a PhD. So, but I'm very blessed to be able to have served in missions now for over 25 years at the church as a pastor. And it's just been a trip of a lifetime. I have the best job. And I've told you this, Matthew, I've got the best job in the world. I mean, one of the largest churches in America and in the country, and to be able to work in missions and be part of a church that gives more than a tithe to missions, it's just been a blessing. So,
Larry, when you say you're, in your 70s doing your PhD, I just think of Paul when he says, very late in life, bring the scrolls. He's still reading the Word. He's still learning, and it's that lifelong learning thing comes out so clear in the life of the Apostle Paul. So. Bless you, and so glad to hear that.
Yeah.
Hey, can you give us a little bit more information about your church?
Yeah. Well, we're a non-denominational church. A guy by the name of Don Wilson started it, 40 some years ago in 1982, and he brought to the church a theology of missions. He was very missions minded from day one. We have tithed to missions. Even when we would do building projects and things like that, whatever was given to complete a phase of the church, we tithed on that to missions. So 10% of that went to missions. And so over the years, we grew from 4 people to where we're averaging well over 50,000 a weekend now. We are at 18 different campuses, and we've got 3 more in the works. And so we're just going to continue to do what, God wants us to do until He changes that. And we try to set aside 30% of our giving goes to the planting and expansion of the ministry. So,
yeah, it's great. So, Larry, when you reached out to me a few years ago, it was through our web portal, and there was a couple questions that asked about your church, and I saw the size of the church, and I told my team, I said, this can't be real. I said, I think this is some type of a robot or something, not real. Sure enough, it was real. So, Larry, there's this very popular philosophy in churches throughout the U.S. today, and it's been a dominant philosophy for a few decades now. And I think it's a well-intentioned philosophy. And it says this: every follower of Christ is a missionary. Every good, altruistic, evangelistic work done in Jesus' name is a missions work. A few years ago, you began to question those philosophies. Tell us how that happened.
Well, probably 6, 7, 8 years ago, I began looking at our missions strategy and realized that we have been following the traditional path of a lot of churches where the churches start a missions organization, a missions department, or a missions ministry. And it's usually made up of those missionaries that are friends of the pastor or was somehow got in front of the lead pastor and ended up getting supported. And as I looked at what we had, and that's pretty much what I inherited. And as I looked at that, it was obvious to me that it wasn't the best way to decide where to steward God's money, the resources that our people are giving, without going through some kind of vetting process. And so that got me involved looking at, one book, for example, the When Helping Hurts book, really helped me understand how missions could be done and should be done. And we adopted that as a strategy and slowly moved into this philosophy and model of community health evangelism. And we changed our model, we changed our strategy, and we was down that path. And it wasn't too long after that I began to realize how many people there were in the world that's never even heard the name of Jesus. And the whole unreached people group and unengaged people groups was fairly new to me in terms of what it really meant and how many was really that involved. And then, of course, that led to some research, and that began we began to realize that we need to really take that serious and start looking into how we could shift perhaps some of our resources. Because I think at the time we were giving in single digits percentage-wise into anything that resembled an unreached people group. So we began to look at that. And then it was really COVID, to be honest with you, Matthew, that really hit home because, we were all kind of home for a few weeks there. CCV was one of these churches that did not really subscribe to the, shutdown rule. We shut down because the state mandated it. But even then we sort of rebelled at that. And within 2 weeks we were back open. Of course, it was a bit of a controversy at the time, but we were working from home a lot, and a lot of time for me to reflect and study and pray, and an opportunity as to where should we go with missions at CCV. And it was during that time that I read this book. Somebody by the name of Matthew Ellison and Dennis Skinner, I think, wrote it, and it began to question some of the thoughts and beliefs that I've held for a long time. And that really got me thinking. And at the time, I was involved in a motorcycle ministry called Black Sheep. And it was a Christian motorcycle ministry, not unlike a lot of those ministries. And I began to read your book, and there was some question in there about the terms and definition and how important it is that words matter. And one of those words was missionary. And we began to throw all these terms around so loosely, like missions or missional or missionary. And this ministry, a motorcycle ministry, kept claiming that all of the members of Black Sheep were missionaries. And yet I would look and see, how are they missionaries? We come out on the weekends and ride together, and we call ourselves missionaries. And it just did not feel right. We didn't have the skin in the game. We didn't sacrifice. We didn't drop everything that we had and go to a place in the world where, we walked away from family and friends and everything else. And those are missionaries. But here we were calling ourselves missionaries. So I got into some trouble when I questioned that, and within that motorcycle ministry. So to answer your question, it's really a lot of these words that we've been throwing around for years that I began to question and really understand what missions is all about.
So as you went through that process, there's a lot of talk in missions always about reimagining all this business, but you evidently thought, no, I need to rediscover. Talk about what that process was like for you.
Yeah, that's a very good word, because it wasn't about redefining missions. It wasn't about maybe we should change our strategy or tweak it here or there. We need to kind of wipe the slate clean and just kind of rediscover missions. And that began with just let's make sure we got the words right and we understand them. And that led to a little research project on my part. Is I was curious as to how these church leaders around that was within my network, how would they define missions in the context of the local church? And so that led to, I think, over 20 different missiologists and church leaders and missions leaders that I know around the world, that I would just simply write to them and say, I'd like for you to give me a one-sentence definition of missions. And all of them did, and all of them were different. And, it's everything from taking the gospel to where the church is not. And, it's the ministry that the work does, and missions is putting the church where it doesn't exist, and all of these lessons. So I kind of compiled all their inputs and came up with our own to add to the already list that was there, which was fulfilling the Great Commission that's inspired, or fulfilling the Great Commissions that's inspired by the Great Commandments. And that became our definition of missions here at CCV. But looking at the places where we were working and the amount of people out there, and actually looking at the economics of and the financials of what does it cost to reach someone, it was very obvious that you could reach a third of the population of the world a whole lot more, a lot cheaper than you could even people in our own backyard. I'm not saying that we don't reach the people in our own backyard. I'm just saying, from a stewardship standpoint, assuming that God values every life the same, that he doesn't say, oh, you Americans are much more important than other people around the world, which we know he doesn't say that, then why wouldn't we look at shifting our finances to being the most effective in the ministry? And that would be to start shifting funding to the unreached people groups. And that's what we did. And it didn't happen in a year, but we went from, I don't know, almost 3 or 4% of our, at one time, of our, finances going to unreached people groups to now, close to, it's over 30%. And my goal is just to kind of keep going. And so, now that's not been easy, because to convince leadership of the church, even at CCV, to do that has not been an easy thing. And that's my greatest fear for where missions is that there is this trend across the country from the people that even within my network, that the trend is to start focusing more inward, or at least more locally. Mm-hmm. And as that happens, it's very easy for the leadership of churches to start defining missions as everything. I have once had a music pastor tell me that he would like for missions to fund some new music instruments that he has or needs to buy. And his explanation was because it's missional. Those new guitars they're missional because they're being used to reach people for Christ. And so when you take that definition, then you get what you said in your book, Matthew. Then if you define everything as missions, I think it was, then nothing becomes missions.
Right. That's from Stephen Neal. It's a profound quote. I've probably surfaced this a few times on the podcast with Ted, because this is not the first time this topic has surfaced, and it's an evergreen topic. It's been around for decades. It's not going away anytime soon. As you pointed out, at least anecdotally, I think churches are turning inward right now. I talk to a lot of churches, and they're dropping their cross-cultural missions budget and unreached missions budget, and they're turning it to home. But what I want to surface is this. It's something that Justin Long, he's a missiologist, says. And he says, when pastors and Christians in general, Christian leaders, when they say everyone's a missionary, they don't really mean it. He said, I think what they mean is everyone's an evangelist. Everyone's a disciple. Everyone's a disciple maker. Everyone should be doing outreach. And he has this train of thought that he uses. He says, okay, let's assume everyone's a missionary pastor. Are you saying that the Holy Spirit, like in Acts 13, has appointed every individual in your church to be identified by the elders, supported, raised up, sent out to a different culture to proclaim the gospel? Is that God's will for every member of your church? And of course, the pastor says, well, of course not. Like, they know inherently, like, that's not true. Not everyone has that gifting. And then Justin says, well, then you proceed to say, well, what do we describe that person? I mean, what do we call the person we just described? Appointed by the Spirit, identified, raised up, they go into a new culture. And the person says, well, a missionary. So you don't really mean everyone's a missionary. You mean everyone's an evangelist. We wouldn't call everyone a pastor, and yet with this terminology, we're pretty loose with it. So you've already hit on some of the impact at CCV, the growing missions budget to the unreached and things like that. Maybe you can talk about some of the impact in your people as their eyes have been lifted to see the unreached in the nations. How has that impacted the people of the church?
Well, I think, I have a podcast as well that really the listener base is pretty much the people at our church. It goes over the mission partners, mission trips we've been on. And there's a story behind every trip we make. There's a story behind everyone we talk to, that when we go into some of these unreached areas, that profoundly changes them. Being involved in missions as long as I have, mission trips have been a big part of most missions or departments or missions ministries inside of churches. And there was a time that I would wake up in the morning, and one morning I would wake up and say, we're never going to do another mission trip. All we do is spend a lot of money to go over there, paint a few houses, and come back. Why don't we just send them the money, let them paint their own houses, and we're done. And then I talk to someone who comes back and says, I went on this mission trip. It changed my life. And here's how it changed my life. And it changed my family's life. And my husband now comes to church because they see that I'm changed. So, and I'm like, okay, now we're going to do nothing but mission trips. and so over that period of time, began to develop the training and the preparation of people before we send them on the trips. For mainly the sole purpose of going and being transformed. When we go on these trips to these areas that, like the Holy Lands, or like, for instance, Cuba, for instance, where the ability to knock on a door and actually start a conversation with someone that who does not know you, and you don't know them, and how easy it is to go in and actually talk with them about Christ, about Scripture, about how God can change their life and what it means to them, or what it could mean for them, and then to actually see them go to the next step, changes you, and that began to change the people that were going these trips. When they come back, they are much more open to saying something at a restaurant to a waiter, or to talking to a neighbor, because it's given them the boldness, so to speak, of actually going to do that, because they didn't have anything to lose in Cuba. They were never going to see those people again. And they would step out, and sure enough, a lot of them would be changed because of that.
So when I hear you, so I'm often the one beating up on short-term trips. And I think my concern is that these trips are often about discipling the goers, and they're not really focused on reaching the unreached. Now, I understand there's limitations when you take a bunch of people overseas that have never been cross-cultural before, and there's a need for that kind of investment. But it does seem to me that this is a little bit of a micro picture of what's going on, not at your church, obviously, but at many churches, where missions is really about congregational engagement. It's about discipling the people in the church. And it's not really, except in an abstract way, of trying to build vision in the congregants' minds about the future that they could potentially invest in the unreached. Is there not a way to do short term in which it's really about the unreached and not just about the discipleship of the goers?
Well, I think the experience that we've had with the unreached in terms of our engagement has primarily been in just the one in the people that we've actually sent to the unreached areas. We are not a big church right now that would be interested in sending anyone, any Western, any American, anyone from our church that would, and I have them come regularly and tell me that, they feel God has is calling us to go to Uganda, or they're calling us to go to, these areas that's already saturated with Christians. We have a long talk about that, and I explained to them why we're not interested in doing that. But if you're interested in going to Tunisia or someplace where there are unreached people groups, where the only way that they're going to hear about Jesus is through you going there, then we can talk. So it's not so much in the short-term trips; it's more in the long-term commitments that we try to focus on more within the missions here at CCV.
I'll insert something here, Ted. I know this is Larry. He's our guest, but I can't resist here. One of the things that, I communicate to churches that we coach that are developing, long-term strategic vision to take the gospel across culturally and, having a big portion of that to the unreached, to the least reached. If you have those short-term trips, one of the questions you can have that participant ask before the trip, during the trip, and after the trip is, what does this experience mean for my long-term involvement in missions? So it's not an isolated experience. And then using the trip to educate about God's heart for the nations, the meta-narrative, the redemptive story. And as Larry pointed out, use that trip to kind of do a perspectives in miniature, if you will. So they finish the trip and they see the world differently, and they start to say, how do I fit into God's story on the other side? How can I be a part of getting the gospel to Tunisia or whatever it might be? That simple question, and I didn't come up with it. It's from Robertson McQuilkin, who's in heaven now, who was really frustrated at short-term missions, but he said, you can't beat him. I got to join him. And he said, you have to answer this question. What does it mean for your long-term involvement in taking the gospel to those who've never heard? I think it's a great question.
Yeah, I think there is a value in the short-term trips. In fact, we just had an all-staff meeting where they asked me to talk about missions, and what my main message was to our staff, which there's 450 of them, by the way, is that they need to become world Christians. The only way to do that is to expose them to the world views and to the world. And not everyone will be interested in going to an unreached place. In fact, that's part of the problem we have today, I think, within the church, especially in large churches. The larger church has a tendency to want to communicate something to the congregation that they can relate to. So a lot of that communication is to things going on in our community, things going on in our country, and within CCV, we have the great the Acts model of here, near, and far. So our here is Jerusalem. The near is the Mexico and within the United States, the Samaria and Judea, and then of course the ends of the world is the far. So we have a tendency to only focus on the near things. We have a tendency to focus on those things that will pull at the heartstrings of someone sitting in the congregation. Well, unfortunately, the heartstring. If you give our congregation or the people in churches the choice of supporting a starving person, a small child who's homeless here in their city, or do you want to support an unreached people group in Tunisia or someplace? Well, they're going to go to their heart's going to go to that small child, right? You can't compete with that. So that's the tendency of what's communicated a lot of times in churches. So you have to start somewhere. And, I've found that sometimes starting with a trip to Africa or a trip to Cuba or someplace like that at least opens the mind up so that when we come back, we can then start getting more involved to who they're going to be standing with in Revelation. At the end of time, we're not going to be standing next to perhaps the person we live next door to. We might be standing next to some person from Tunisia, or worse, not standing next to someone in Tunisia because he's somewhere else.
Well, Larry, let me just say, I love the story. There's so many mega churches that do very little in global mission. Now, there's some stellar exceptions to that rule. You guys are obviously one of them. And so for me, it's super exciting. I think that what I sense as I listen to you speak is the developmental nature of the short-term trip toward a bigger, destination in terms of what it means to really to disciple the nations.
Mm-hmm.
And I would hope that we see a growing number of churches have that developmental idea. I know of one church, and they let you go on a short-term trip somewhere. If you go back and you want to go to the same place, they say no repeat offenders. Now you got to go to a place that's a little more rugged, a little less reached, and they basically try to push people along a funnel of different experiences until they're really going on short-term trips that are to completely unreached places.
Wow, I like that. I
Yeah.
love that. Yeah.
So, Larry, one final question. I imagine there's some pastors listening, church leaders. Perhaps they've been calling everyone a missionary for so long. It's just, it's normal. We hear it so often. And maybe they're being convinced, but they're frustrated because they're wondering, where do I go from here? This has been our language so long. What steps do I take? What does it look like? Encourage that pastor that's wanting to clarify definitions and terms like you did, but maybe they're frustrated by the prospect of that.
Well, I would highly recommend anyone that's in that stage to give you a call and get a mobilized workshop scheduled. We've had a couple of them here, as you know, in Phoenix. They've been phenomenal. And I've talked with those pastors who have attended your workshop, and it is the catalyst that gets them to realize that they need to rethink or rediscover perhaps what's going on within their own missions, because they have a huge resource at their disposal. I mean, many of those churches do tithe to missions, and so they perhaps have one of the biggest budget items within their church. Very few other items within the church has a 10% budget. And it's their responsibility to steward those finances well. And because God has given them the missions responsibility in that area, they need to check out a couple of your books. Couple of your books started me thinking a lot. The Mobilized Workshop really helped a lot, and so it's a journey, and and that's what it is.
Yeah, I appreciate that. It's a process. It's a journey. I think those are great words. And as we come to a close, Ted, you know what this means? It's time for What Do You Like?
Something I like. So I want to mention to you something called Mission Hits. So there's a missiologist on X. His name is Chris Howells. You can find him at Chris Howells, Howles. He's a British missiologist who up until recently was working in Africa. And once a month, he puts out a list of interesting missions articles that he's collected throughout the month. And Chris has become a friend, and I really appreciate him. And you're getting missiology from a non-U.S. perspective. It's a really healthy thing for us to eat from different smorgasbord tables, and that's one of them that I really like. So look for Mission Hits on X. Follow at Chris Howells, and you can be informed of when that's coming out.
Great. That's great. I'm going to close with a quote from Dick Brogden, a friend of Ted and I's. And Larry, you read Conversations on When Everything is Missions, and he has a chapter in it, but it's just a great way to summarize our talk today. Dick wrote in Conversations on When Everything is Missions this: if we are sloppy in our definitional work, what missions is or isn't, we will always disenfranchise those who have least access to the gospel.
Wow.
Powerful. So sloppy definitional work, we're going to disenfranchise those who are they're out of reach right now. So Larry, thank you so much for sharing your story and your journey. It's been a pleasure having you on the podcast.
Thank you.
Before you go, be sure to like, share, and subscribe so you don't miss the next episode. The Mission Matters podcast is a partnership of 1615 and Missio Nexus. Check out 1615.org and missionexus.org for more resources on the mission of God and the matters of the mission. The Mission Matters podcast is hosted by Matthew Ellison, president of 1615, and Ted Essler, president of Missio Nexus.